The alien planet was silent, the only sound being the soft hum of the wind as it brushed against the tall, rocky cliffs. In the distance, the human soldier, Jackson, stood alone, his eyes scanning the horizon. The mission had been simple: retrieve the stolen data and leave, but things never went as planned. Now Jackson found himself deep in the enemy's territory, surrounded by hostile forces. He had been captured. The alien who held him was tall, her body a perfect blend of muscle and grace. She stood with confidence, her bright blue eyes fixed on Jackson, studying him. Her name was Zira, and she was one of the fiercest warriors of her people. Her race was known for its strength and intelligence, and they saw humans as weak, fragile creatures. Jackson didn't look afraid. He didn't even flinch when the guards roughly pushed him into the open arena, a place where many humans had met their end. His calmness confused them. Most humans would have been shaking in fear, begging for mercy, but not Jackson. Zira raised an eyebrow as she took a step toward him. "Why aren't you afraid, human?" she asked, her voice low and sharp, cutting through the silence. Jackson met her gaze without hesitation. There was no fear in his eyes, only calm determination. He stood tall, not backing down. "Because fear doesn't control me," he said quietly, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. Zira was taken aback. She had expected him to tremble, to beg for his life, but instead he stood there unshaken. It was unlike anything she had seen before. Humans were weak, emotional creatures. But this one was different. She circled him, studying his face. "You must be a fool, human. This is the end for you," she said, her tone cold and unforgiving. "You are in my territory now, and your kind are nothing but prey." Jackson didn't flinch. "I've faced worse." Zira's eyes narrowed. She had heard stories about human resilience, but she had never believed them. The humans she had encountered were always scared, always easy to control. But this one, he was different. "You think you can take me on?" she asked, stepping closer until she was almost nose to nose with him. Her height and strength made her intimidating, but Jackson didn't back away. His gaze remained locked on hers. "I don't need to take you on," he replied. "I only need to survive." Zira's lips curled into a smirk. She wasn't used to being talked to like this. She had been trained to fight and dominate, not to face someone who could stare her down without blinking. She had been taught that fear was the one thing that would break any opponent, but this human, he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "You think your mind is stronger than your body?" Zira asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Your body will fail you eventually. Fear is a natural response, and it will come. You will break." But Jackson just shook his head. "I don't break," he said. "Not like others." Zira stopped, in her tracks, studying him more intently now. There was something about his calmness that unsettled her. She had been trained to expect fear, to see it in every human she captured. But with him there was nothing. It was as though he had seen it all before, like nothing could surprise him. She took a step back, raising her hand to signal her guards. They stepped forward, ready to do her bidding, but Zira raised a hand to stop them. "No," she said softly, still staring at Jackson. This one is different." Jackson didn't react to the change in her tone. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed, waiting for whatever came next. He knew that his calmness was unnerving her, and that gave him power. He wasn't afraid of her or of anything. He had learned long ago that fear was a weakness, and in his line of work, weakness was deadly. Zira took another step closer, her eyes searching his face for any sign of weakness. "I've fought many humans before," she said, her voice still, cold. "You all break in the end. Your minds crack and your bodies follow, but you—" She paused, tilting her head. "You're different." Jackson didn't answer. Instead, he looked into her eyes, unblinking. The silence between them grew thick with tension, neither of them willing to back down. Zira felt the air shift around them. The power she was used to holding over her opponents was slipping through her fingers. The human wasn't intimidated, and that troubled her. She had never met a human who didn't fear her kind. It was supposed to be simple: capture the enemy, break them, and win. But Jackson was changing the rules. "You're not what I expected," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low but filled with a quiet strength. "No one ever is." Zyra stepped back, her thoughts swirling. She had expected this to be a victory, a triumph of her species over the fragile human race. But now, standing before her, was a human who was fearless, who saw right through her and wasn't afraid. It made her question everything she had ever believed about her enemies. "You should be afraid," she said, her voice hardening again. "I could end you with a thought," but Jackson only shook his head again. "You can try," he said, his tone calm and steady. "But you won't." The alien warrior didn't know how to respond. She had never been in a situation like this before. For the first time, she wondered if this human might just be telling the truth. He might not be afraid, and that was something she could never understand. With one last look, she turned away, signaling her guards to prepare for what was next. But she knew one thing for sure: this human was unlike any other she had ever faced. The atmosphere was tense. Jackson stood in the center of the open arena, surrounded by Zyra and her warriors. His hands were bound, but his expression was calm, as if he were waiting for a simple conversation instead of an impending battle. He had faced dangerous enemies before, but this alien warrior, was different. Zyra's blue eyes, filled with a mix of curiosity and irritation, locked onto Jackson. She had watched him closely since their encounter earlier, and the human's fearlessness was starting to annoy her. She had fought many humans before, soldiers, rebels, and mercenaries, but none of them had ever stood their ground the way he did. Most humans would have begged for mercy by now, but not Jackson. He had stared into her eyes as if he was waiting for something more than just his life to be decided. She stepped forward, her footsteps silent but powerful. The air around them seemed to grow heavier with each step. "You're a strange one," she said, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Do you not realize what I can do to you?" Jackson didn't answer. His eyes followed her movements, taking in every detail of her body language, every subtle shift in her stance. He had learned long ago to study his enemies, to understand their minds before reacting. Zyra's arrogance was her weakness, and Jackson had learned to use it to his advantage. Zyra stopped in front of him, her tall figure casting a shadow over him. "You must know that your fate is sealed," she said, her voice growing colder. "I will make an example of you. Your death will be a warning to your kind." Jackson raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. He was prepared for whatever came next. Fear had never been a part of his training. He had learned that true strength came from within, not from the ability to destroy. He didn't need to break her, he only needed to survive. Without warning, Zyra motioned to her warriors. They advanced, each of them armed with sharp, gleaming blades. The humans she had captured before had never seen combat on her planet, but Jackson was different. His training was special, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to defeat all of them, but that wasn't the point. One of the warriors lunged at him, his sword raised high. Jackson stepped to the side with surprising speed, the blade missing him by inches. He didn't hesitate. With a swift move, he grabbed the warrior's wrist and twisted it, causing the blade to drop to the ground. The warrior cried out in pain, but Jackson wasn't finished. He kicked the alien's leg, sending him crashing to the floor. Zyra watched, in silence, her eyes narrowing. This human was fast and his movements were precise. He wasn't just defending himself. He was attacking, countering every move with skill and precision. But it wasn't just his physical ability that intrigued her. It was his calmness, his complete lack of fear. Another warrior charged at him from behind. This time, Jackson didn't need to turn around. He dropped to the ground, using his legs to sweep the alien off his feet. As the warrior fell, Jackson rolled to his feet and grabbed the fallen blade, now holding two weapons. The remaining warriors hesitated. They had seen their comrade fall so easily, and they weren't sure what to make of this human. Most of the time humans were predictable, but this one was anything but. Sira felt a flicker of doubt in her chest. She had expected him to crumble, to beg for his life. But here he was, standing tall, not even breaking a sweat, and taking on her warriors without hesitation. "Enough," Sira commanded, her voice cold and authoritative. Her warriors paused, stepping back, but Jackson didn't lower his guard. His eyes remained fixed on Sira, waiting for the next move. She walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "You fight well," she said, her voice almost respectful, "but strength isn't enough to defeat me." Jackson didn't respond. He knew that he wasn't here to defeat her. He was here to survive, and surviving meant understanding his opponent. Sira was powerful, yes, but she was also driven by pride. He had already seen it in her eyes. That was where her weakness lay. Sira stopped just a few feet away from him, her tall frame looming over him. "I've never met a human like you," she said quietly. "You're not afraid of me." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not afraid of you. But I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to live." Sira studied him closely, her eyes flickering with something like curiosity. She had never heard a human speak like this before. Most of them were either begging or cowering, but Jackson was different. He wasn't afraid to stand in her presence, even when he knew that death was hanging over him. "You should fear me," Sira said, her voice lowering. "I could end your life in an instant. I could crush you with a thought." Jackson finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "You could try." For a moment, Sira said nothing. She was used to having the upper hand in these situations, but something about Jackson was making her question her confidence. She had faced so many enemies before, creatures that trembled in fear and begged for their lives. But Jackson wasn't like them. He wasn't even showing the slightest hint of fear. "You're wasting your time," she said finally, her tone sharp. "I'm not interested in games. You'll lose and your people will pay the price." Jackson shook his head. "I'm not afraid of losing," he said. "But I won't give you the satisfaction of breaking me." Sira's expression darkened. She had been trained to break her enemies, to make them fear her until they crumbled. But this human, this one human, wasn't afraid of her. And that, more than anything, was starting to unsettle her. "Don't mistake my patience for weakness," she said, her voice hard. "You will not survive much longer." But Jackson didn't flinch. "We'll see about that," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. Sira's mind raced. For the first time, she was unsure of how to handle this human. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't backing down. He had already broken through her defenses, not with strength, but with his sheer resolve. And that, more than anything, was something she didn't understand. With a final glance, she turned and motioned for her warriors to follow. "We'll see how long your courage lasts," she said over her shoulder. But Jackson stood still, unbroken. He knew the real battle was only just beginning. The days passed slowly in the alien prison, the silence broken only by the sounds of distant machinery and the occasional footsteps of the guards. Jackson had been moved to a small, windowless cell, his hands no longer bound, but still under constant watch. He spent most of his time sitting against the cold stone wall, meditating or simply thinking. Sira had not come to see him since their last encounter, but Jackson felt her presence. It was strange, the way she seemed to linger in the air around him. She hadn't spoken much after their fight, but something had shifted between them. She had walked away from him that day, but he knew she was still watching, still wondering why he hadn't broken. The soft clang of metal echoed through the hallway, and Jackson knew that Sira was coming. Her footsteps were heavy, sure, and every step seemed to shake the ground beneath her. She was the last person he had expected to come and speak to him again. Her pride and arrogance had kept her at a distance, but now she was here. The door to his cell opened with a creak, and Sira stepped inside. Her usual confidence was still there, but there was something different in her eyes. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied him from the doorway, as if trying to figure him out. Jackson didn't look up at first. He knew she was there, but he wasn't going to let her see that he cared. "You've been quiet," she said after a long pause, her voice softer than usual. "I expected you to be different." Jackson finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "What do you want from me, Zira?" His voice was calm, controlled. He had no interest in playing games. She had already shown him what she was capable of, and now it was her turn to show her hand. Zira stepped closer, her expression unreadable. She crossed her arms over her chest, her blue eyes locked onto his. "I want to know why you're not afraid," she said quietly. "Why you haven't broken. You should be afraid of me. You should fear what I could do to you." Jackson stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, his tone steady. "I never have been." Zira's eyes narrowed, and she took a step forward. "You think that makes you strong? You think that makes you different from the others? Fear is a natural part of being alive. It keeps you safe. It makes you smart." Jackson shook his head. "Fear doesn't keep you safe. It controls you. It makes you weak. And I won't let it control me." Zira took another step closer, her gaze intense. "You think you're strong because you don't fear me? You think you can face death without flinching? You're just a human. You're not built for this." Jackson stood tall, meeting her challenge, head on. "Maybe not," he said, his voice low. "But I've survived worse than this." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Zira's eyes searched his face, looking for any hint of weakness, but all she saw was strength. A quiet, unyielding strength that didn't come from muscle or power, but from something deeper. She frowned, her mind racing. She had spent her entire life learning to conquer fear, to crush it beneath her boot. It was the one thing that made her stronger than the humans she had encountered. It was how she had risen to the top of her people's ranks, how she had become a warrior feared across the galaxy. And yet here was this human standing before her unafraid. "Tell me, human," Zira said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "What have you faced that makes you so sure of yourself?" Jackson paused, his eyes drifting toward the floor as if the weight of his memories were pulling him down. For a moment, Zira thought he might not answer, but then, in the quietest of voices, he spoke. "I've seen war. I've seen death. I've watched people I loved disappear one by one. I've fought battles I couldn't win, but I fought anyway. I've lost friends, lost parts of myself. And through all of that, I never let fear take over. Fear didn't save me. Strength did. The strength to keep going, the strength to keep living." Zira stood silent, her mind processing his words. She had never heard a human speak like this before. They were always so quick to show their emotions, to wear their fear on their sleeves. But Jackson, he had been through so much, yet he stood before her, unshaken, unbroken. "How?" she whispered, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Jackson looked at her then, his gaze softer than before. "It's not about being afraid of dying, it's about living. It's about doing what you can with the time you have." Zira stood still, the words echoing in her mind. She had always thought that fear was the only thing that made her strong. She had believed that it was the force that pushed her forward, that made her a warrior. But now, as she stood before this human, she began to question everything she had ever known. "You're not afraid of me," Zira said almost to herself. "Why?" Jackson stepped closer, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "Because fear doesn't control me. I control it." For a long moment, there was silence. Zira didn't know what to say. She had never met anyone like Jackson. His words had shaken her, and for the first time in her life, she felt a flicker of doubt. "You're not like other humans," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I've never met anyone like you before." Jackson gave a small smile, though it was not one of triumph. "Maybe you just haven't met the right one yet." Zira's heart raced. She had been trained to break her enemies, to crush them, to see their fear and use it against them. But Jackson had done something she hadn't expected. He had made her question herself. He had made her feel vulnerable. For the first time, she wasn't sure how this would end. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to break him. The days following their conversation were strange. Zyra visited Jackson more often, though each time her visits were brief. She still held her power over him, but there was a shift in the way she looked at him. Her thoughts seemed to be clouded, and the questions in her mind began to grow louder. He wasn't the same as the others. She had expected him to cower, to beg for his life, but instead, he had stood his ground and remained unbroken. She found herself coming to his cell more than once, sometimes just standing in silence, watching him as he meditated or sat with his back against the cold stone wall. He never spoke first. But when their eyes met, she saw something she hadn't expected, a kind of quiet strength, a strength that didn't come from fear, but from something deeper, something human. "Do you ever stop thinking?" she asked, one day the question slipping out before she could stop herself. She was standing in the doorway watching him as he sat, still and calm as ever. Jackson looked up, a slight smile on his face. "I think when I need to," he replied, his voice steady as always. Zyra couldn't help but wonder what it would take to break him, but as she stood there, she realized that every time she came to see him, it wasn't just because she wanted to see him suffer. No, she was coming because she wanted to understand him. She wanted to know what made him so different. "Why don't you fight back?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "I know you're capable. You've shown me that much." Jackson stood up slowly, his posture relaxed. He had grown used to her visits, though he didn't show it. "Fighting won't get me anywhere," he said, his voice calm. "I don't need to fight you, I need to survive. And surviving doesn't always mean using force." Zyra stared at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So you think you can just sit there and wait for me to release you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "You think that's how this works?" Jackson shook his head. "No, I don't think that. I think you're trying to figure me out. And that's why you keep coming back." For the first time, Zyra didn't know how to respond. She was used to being in control, to having the answers. But Jackson had made her question everything she knew about herself and about humans. She had never met someone who could make her feel this way. Uncertain, vulnerable. "You're not afraid of me," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I've never met anyone who wasn't afraid of me." Jackson didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the bars of his cell, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm not afraid because I understand you," he said simply. "You're not the monster you think you are." Zyra blinked, startled by his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of confusion. "I've seen people like you before," Jackson replied. "Strong, proud, convinced. That fear is what keeps them alive. But it's not. It's the choices you make. The way you handle what comes at you. You choose to fight, but you could choose something else." Zyra stepped back, her mind racing. She had never been spoken to like this. She had never been told that her strength was a choice, that she didn't have to be the monster she had always believed herself to be. His words felt like a challenge, one that was harder to ignore than she would have liked. "Why do you keep saying that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why do you keep telling me that I can change? I've been this way my whole life. I've been trained to be strong, to be a warrior." Jackson's expression softened. "Strength doesn't just come from fighting. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away from a fight. It's about knowing when to stop, when to let go of what you think you need. You don't have to be a monster, Zyra." Zyra felt a knot form in her stomach. She had spent so much of her life proving herself, proving that she was worthy of respect and power. She had built her identity around fear and control. But now, standing before this human who wasn't afraid of her, she found herself questioning everything she had ever known. Was there more to her than just the warrior she had been trained to be? She didn't know the answer. And that frightened her. "I don't know how to be anything else," Zyra whispered, almost too quietly for Jackson to hear. You don't have to be anything else, Jackson replied, his voice gentle but firm. You just have to decide what you want to be. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had always seen herself as a warrior, as a symbol of her people's strength. But now, she was starting to see that maybe there was more to her than just that. Maybe, just maybe, she had the power to choose who she was, to choose how she wanted to be remembered. Zira turned away, her emotions swirling. She couldn't deny the pull of his words. It was easier to hold on to the identity she had known for so long, to keep being the warrior she had been trained to be. But something inside her was changing. She felt it, a subtle shift in the way she viewed the world. When she turned back to face Jackson, her expression was unreadable. I don't know what you've done to me, human, she said, her voice filled with uncertainty. But you've made me see things I never wanted to see. Jackson didn't respond. Instead, he just watched her, his gaze steady. He wasn't trying to change her. He was simply showing her a different way of thinking, a way that didn't involve fear or domination. I'm not your enemy, he said, quietly. I never was. Zira met his gaze for a long moment, and for the first time she saw something in him that she hadn't before. It wasn't fear, but it was something that made her pause. Respect, understanding, a quiet strength she hadn't expected from a human. She turned and walked toward the door, but before she left, she spoke one final time. I'll be back, she said, her voice soft but resolute. I need to think. Jackson didn't respond. He knew she would come back, but this time, it wouldn't just be to break him. She was starting to understand that there was more to life than fear and power, and that perhaps was the biggest victory of all. The next few days passed in a strange quiet. Zira didn't visit as often, and Jackson began to wonder if she had forgotten about him. Or perhaps she was struggling with what he had said, the words that had caused her to doubt everything she had known about herself. He could feel the shift, the change in the air, but he didn't press her. It was her decision now, just as it had always been. Jackson spent his days in the small cell, meditating, thinking, and waiting. He had learned patience long ago. It was the one thing that had kept him alive through countless battles. He didn't need to fight every battle. He only needed to fight the ones that mattered. And the battle with Zira, that was one he hadn't expected to win. But now he wasn't so sure it was about winning at all. He could feel her presence even before the door opened. Zira's footsteps were heavy, sure, and the air seemed to thicken when she was near. When the door creaked open, Jackson didn't look up immediately. He knew it was her. He had learned to sense when she was close. You're still here, Zira said, her voice low. There was something different in it this time, something softer. Jackson finally looked up, meeting her gaze. I'm not going anywhere, he said, simply. Zira stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She didn't stand by the bars this time. Instead, she walked across the room and sat down on the cold stone floor, a few feet away from him. Her usual confident demeanor had softened, replaced by something Jackson couldn't quite read. I've been thinking, she said, her voice more thoughtful than he had ever heard it. About what you said. About fear and strength. Jackson nodded. He had been expecting this. He didn't rush her. He let her speak at her own pace. He knew that for someone like her, these thoughts weren't easy to process. She had built her entire life around control, around the idea that fear was what made her strong. I've always believed that fear is what made me strong, Zira continued, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Fear of losing, fear of weakness, it's what kept me sharp. It's what kept me alive. Jackson watched her closely, his expression calm. He didn't interrupt. She was starting to open up, and that was something he hadn't expected. He had never seen this side of her before. The side that wasn't just a warrior, the side that questioned everything she had been taught. But now, she said, her voice faltering slightly, I don't know what to believe. You've made me question everything. You made me see that there's more to strength than just fear. Jackson leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle. Strength comes from within, Zira. It's not about how much fear you can control, but how much peace you can hold in the middle of chaos. You don't have to be afraid to be strong. Zira looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. How do you know that? She asked. How do you know what it feels like to live without fear? Jackson thought for a moment before answering. I've been to places where fear was the only thing that kept me alive, but I've learned that fear doesn't protect you. It just keeps you from living fully. The real strength is knowing when to face it and when to let it go. Zira stood up suddenly, pacing across the room. Her mind was racing, the words swirling around in her head. She had spent so long building her life on fear and power. Now she wasn't sure what to think. She had always prided herself on being in control, on making others fear her. But now she was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, control wasn't the answer. You're telling me that I've been wrong all this time? She asked, her voice a mixture of frustration and confusion. Jackson shook his head. I'm not saying you've been wrong. I'm saying there's another way. You don't have to be ruled by fear. You don't have to be a monster to be strong. Zira stopped pacing and turned to face him. What if I don't know how to be anything else? What if I can't change? Jackson stood up slowly, his eyes meeting hers. You don't have to change who you are. You just have to be open to who you could be. For a moment there was only silence between them. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Zira's mind was in turmoil. She had always believed that her strength came from her fear, from the power she wielded over others. But now, standing before Jackson, she wasn't so sure anymore. The tension in the room grew, and for the first time Zira didn't know what to do. She had always been the one in control, the one who decided the fate of others. But now, she found herself standing at a crossroads, unsure of the path she should take. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, she admitted, her voice softer than it had been before. Jackson stepped closer, his tone steady and calm. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just need to choose. Zira's heart was pounding. She had spent so much of her life training to be powerful, to be feared. But now, as she looked at Jackson, she realized that maybe there was more to life than power. Maybe, just maybe, the true strength came from letting go of fear and embracing something different. Something she hadn't considered before. I'm not going to hurt you, she said, the words coming out almost in a whisper. Jackson nodded, his expression softening. I know. Zira looked at him, a strange feeling rising in her chest. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to be the one in control. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something new, something like hope. I need to think, she said finally, her voice quiet. Jackson didn't respond, but he understood. He had given her something to think about, something that was starting to change her. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about a choice. The choice to see the world differently, to choose a new path. As Zira left the room, Jackson sat back down, his mind at ease. He had done all he could. The rest was up to her. The days that followed were a blur. Zira came to visit less often, but each time she did, something about her seemed different. There was a quiet calmness to her now, a softness that hadn't been there before. Jackson noticed it right away. But he didn't speak about it. He knew better than to push someone when they weren't ready to talk. He had given her something to think about, and now it was up to her to decide what she wanted to do with that. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the light in the prison room grew dim, the door to Jackson's cell opened. He looked up, expecting one of the guards, but instead Zira stood there, her silhouette framed by the doorway. She was different. She was no longer the fierce warrior who had captured him, no longer the intimidating figure who had tried to break him. Instead, she looked uncertain. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by something much quieter. It was as if she had been on a journey, one that had led her here to this very moment. Can we talk? Zira asked, her voice softer than before. Jackson stood up, nodding. Of course. Zira stepped into the room, her eyes never leaving him. There was no anger, no malice in her gaze anymore. Just something else, something that Jackson couldn't quite put his finger on. She looked around the room as if unsure of how to begin. I've been thinking about everything. About you, about what you said, she began, her voice still unsure. I don't know what I was expecting when I first captured you. I thought it would be just another mission, just another human to break. But you changed everything. Jackson watched her carefully. He had known this moment would come. He had given her the space she needed, the time to think. And now here she was, standing in front of him with a kind of vulnerability he hadn't seen before. It wasn't the kind of vulnerability she showed on the battlefield, where she was, in control. This was different. This was the vulnerability of someone who was beginning to question everything they had believed in. You told me that fear doesn't make you strong, Zira continued, and at first I didn't understand. Fear had always been what made me strong. It was what kept me alive. It was what I used to control everything, to make people obey. But when I looked at you, I realized that you weren't afraid, and I didn't know how to handle that. Jackson nodded. You don't need to control everything to be strong. True strength comes from within. It comes from knowing yourself, from being at peace with who you are, not from trying to make others fear you. Zira looked at him, her blue eyes searching, his face. But how do you know that? How can you be so sure? Jackson smiled gently. Because I've been where you are. I've fought battles, faced enemies that seemed unbeatable. But I've learned that the real battle isn't with others, it's with yourself. Fear can either hold you back or set you free. It's up to you to decide. There was a long silence as Zira took in his words. She looked down, her hands clenching, and unclenching at her sides as if trying to find the right words to say. I never thought it was possible, she said quietly, to live without fear, without control. But I'm starting to see that maybe it's the fear that's been holding me back, not the other way around. Jackson stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. It's not about letting go of everything, it's about letting go of what weighs you down. You don't have to change who you are. You just have to stop letting fear control your every move. Zira swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to rise to the surface. I've spent my whole life building walls around myself. I thought I had to be strong, invincible. But now, standing here with you, I realize that maybe I don't have to be so untouchable. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of confusion and hope. What if I let go of everything I've known? What if I choose a different path? Jackson smiled, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. Then you'll find the strength you've been looking for. Not the kind that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from acceptance, from understanding that you're not alone, that you don't have to carry everything on your own. Zira stood still, the weight of his words sinking in. It was a terrifying thought, to let go of the life she had known for so long. But at the same time, it was a liberating thought. The walls she had built around herself had kept her safe, but they had also kept her isolated, distant from everything and everyone. She had always believed that her strength came from her independence, from her control. But now she was beginning to see that maybe true strength came from connection, from the willingness to trust, to open up, to let someone else in. I don't know if I'm ready, she said softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. You don't have to be ready, Jackson replied. You just have to be willing, and sometimes that's all it takes. Zira took a deep breath as if trying to calm the storm inside her. She had been so sure of herself before, so certain that power and control were all that mattered. But now standing in front of Jackson, she was beginning to see that there was more to life than domination and fear. There was something softer, something kinder, that could be just as strong. I think I want to try, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson nodded. That's all anyone can do. Try. Zyra took one last look at him, her eyes lingering for a moment before she turned and walked toward the door. But before she left, she stopped and looked back at him, her expression thoughtful. "I don't know what will happen next," she said, her voice steady but uncertain. "But whatever it is, I think I'll face it differently now. Thanks to you." Jackson didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes, silence said everything that words couldn't. As the door closed behind her, Jackson sat down, feeling a strange sense of peace. He had come to this place thinking that the fight was with Zyra, that he had to break her to survive. But now he realized that the real victory wasn't about winning a battle. It was about helping someone find their way. And in the end, that was all he had ever wanted.